Happy Tuesday. Welcome back. In another episode of Nutrition Blueprint Podcast. Today we cover three nutrition related studies that looked at one, what happens when you eat a higher protein or egg breakfast versus a cereal breakfast. Two, is taurine supplementation helping you burn more fat when you are doing fasted cardio? And three, we're actually covering the differences or whether a ketogenic diet can help you lose more weight when you're doing a resistance training program compared to a non-ketogenic diet where you're eating carbs. Hopefully you enjoyed this one. We'll see you guys on the next one. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Nutrition Blueprint Podcast. This is your host, Andres Ayesta. This is going to be a short episode. We have been working very hard to build our programs. I think I mentioned this last time. So the podcast, it's not like it's taken a backseat, but of course, I'm sure you guys have noticed that we haven't brought a whole lot of guests into it because, again, one of the things that we have to do is we really need to kind of take care of our clients and really take care of the way that we kind of provide content. So apologies if you felt that you haven't really kind of been seeing a ton of variety. In the last like 5 to 6 episodes have been like solo ones, but I'm hoping that I'm still providing pretty good value to you guys and that the information that I'm providing, it's actually being helpful to you. So today is definitely not going to be a difference. I actually was reading through some really interesting research here and I wanted to actually share it with you. So this is what this podcast is going to be about, starting off with differences in like breakfast composition and some other things like that I think is definitely going to be key. Before we get into it though, just telling you a few different things that we got going on in our life. So right now we recently launched our Nutrition Makeover Method program, which is a 4-month intensive jumpstart process to help you build not only your nutrition lifestyle, but at the same time, we call it like, we help you build 4 pillars of health: nutrition, lifestyle, mindset, and movement. And we kind of teach you how to really get to your goals, whether it's weight loss or not, but at the same time, building a pretty good relationship with food and eliminating the diet mentality, which is really something that is going to help you accomplish your goals in the long term. So definitely we're pretty proud of the program we put together. We already kind of have 15 people in it. Yeah, we just welcome a new member into our team as well. So her name is Darlene Castillo. She is a Puerto Rican dietitian that she joined our team. So she's one of our nutrition success coaches. So for all our Hispanic speakers here, we now have a bilingual, besides me, a bilingual coach that is now actively taking clients into our program. So super excited for that to happen. So guys, if you have any questions about how to join or how to apply for this program, go to the link on our profile. The best step to really you need to be taking is actually joining our Facebook community, where we're actively kind of like providing information as far as how that works and all those different things like that. So I highly suggest and invite you to join if you're not part of it. So that's definitely going to be the first step that you can take. But you can also send us a message directly on Facebook or via email, so we can give you more details as far as how that works. Perhaps jump on a call and get you into our program hopefully soon. Anyways, let's get started into this conversation because we're going to be covering a few different studies, and I'm going to walk you through a few different things that having been released and published recently, which I'm huge into nerdy science and nutrition, and I love to kind of present it in a way that is super helpful to all of you, in a way that is effective. So the first study that we're going to kind of be breaking down, that I'm going to make it more digestible to you, pun intended, is going to be comparing the effects of an egg versus a cereal breakfast on hunger and energy intake at lunch. So really what they did, they were kind of like looking to see and understand the differences that existed. And I apologize if you kind of hear my dog in the background. He's kind of going a little crazy. But what they did in this study is they were trying to understand, if we change the composition of a meal, how does it affect how hungry you are in the subsequent meal or the meal after that? And in this case, it looked at specifically at breakfast. So what they did on the study was what we call it's a randomized control crossover trial. So those are one of the strongest type of research that is applied that you can do. And it was a 2-day study, so it wasn't really like that long. And what they did is they recruited about 50 overweight or obese obese participants based on BMI standards, and they assigned them randomly to one or two groups, either an egg group and I'll explain to you guys what that was in a minute, or a cereal group. About 43 of them actually were kind of like added into the cereal group and 33 to the egg group. So the aim of the study was to examine what kind of effect does changing the composition of that breakfast had on what they call subjective hunger. Subjective hunger is how hungry do they feel, like based on if I ask you how hungry are you right now, and at the same time of how much energy intake they had, or how much calories or how many calories they consumed at a lunch meal that was consumed 4 hours after breakfast. Now, the breakfast, and then most of this summaries, I'm getting it from examine.com, which I highly suggest you guys check out. I don't get paid to say this, but it's one of my top go-to resources for nutritional research. So breakfasts were assigned in a randomized order, and were switched for the subsequent trial. So again, like a crossover trial means like they do it, let's say, for example, I'm part of the egg group. I do it on day one, and then the next day they cross me over to the other group. So now I'm going to be doing the cereal group, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. So they basically trying to kind of like, eliminate the risk of bias and things like that. So the two trials were conducted when a one week washout period in between. That means a washout period means that they wait for another week before they switch you over to the other group. So if you're in an egg group for the first 2 days, then they switch you over, like they wait in a week, and then they actually switch you over to the other group a week after. The breakfast meal, so this is exactly what they give them. For like the egg group, they give in 2 eggs and 2 slices of toast and 10 grams of margarine, which is going to be about 2 teaspoons, and that was in the egg group, or the same amount of calories, but they were given in the form of a cereal, with sugar, milk, and orange juice. So when you think about eggs, 2 eggs are going to have about like 80 calories. So like times 2 is 160. A couple slices of toast probably going to be around the same. So you're looking at probably closer to like a 300, maybe 200, 350 calorie breakfast. And they did the same thing, same amount of calories, let's say 300 to 350 calories. They were given in the form of a cereal with some milk, which it's most likely going to have like not as much protein. So perhaps it's going to be maybe like 7 to 8 grams or so, some sugar, and orange juice. So mostly a carb heavy meal versus a meal that was a little bit more heavier on more fat and protein compared to the other one. Probably about half of the amount of protein in the cereal group compared to the egg group. So lunch was provided 4 hours after the breakfast, and the participants were instructed to eat as much as they wanted to. So literally, like imagine like they give you this 2 breakfasts, and then they bring you into like this like lunch cafeteria, and they tell you like you can eat whatever you want. Like you could do whatever you want, like, this lunchtime, like, you can have whatever you want. And they call that ad libitum energy intake, which is, again, you're not really given the food that you're going to eat. They give you access to food, and you just simply select how much it is. So what they found, which was really interesting, energy intake during lunch, so how many calories they consume, was significantly reduced in the group or after egg breakfast consumption compared to cereal breakfast consumption. So subjective hungers, which is if they ask you how hungry you are, was also reduced by the egg breakfast, whereas the participants that ate the cereal breakfast reporting that hunger returned earlier compared to the egg breakfast. So again, like they put them through the first, like, so I ate the egg breakfast, and they asked me how hungry you are, and they kind of like noticed how much I ate. And then they did the same thing next week after I had the cereal, and I just simply kind of like explained that. Right. So, of course, there's a lot of like limitations in this study. But what I wanted to kind of get to in here is something that we typically teach to all of our clients in our programs, which is like the importance of protein for satiety and for hunger management. When you're trying to lose weight, the biggest things that are going to kind of go against you is going to be hunger, because when hunger is high, it's harder for you to make decisions. Because hunger, it's something that you definitely have to fight against. Like it's like it's an unnatural thing for your body to experience, or not an unnatural. It's like your body's trying to fight you and trying to get you to get or to eat this, a specific amount of food. So of course, when you do that, like it's hard. It's easier for you to sometimes overconsume certain foods because hunger obviously takes over. So when we add more protein into the equation of your meal, or into like the composition of your meal, what we're doing is we're trying to increase your satiety. So when you have more satiety, you have less chances that you're going to eat too much. And, we teach you the whole concept of macro counting and like counting nutrients and counting calories and all that to kind of help create awareness around that. But the reality is that some people don't do that. So the question is like, how do you manage your hunger levels, and how do you manage your calorie consumption without having to track? And this is one way, right? So like they had exactly the same amount of calories, but one group actually felt a lot like they felt hungrier a lot quicker compared to the group that had the breakfast. And it wasn't really that big of a difference, because they just say, for example, and I don't think they explain here the exact amount. I'm trying to see if I can find this on here. The exact amount of calories that they consumed in the meal. Let's see if I can kind of like find this on here. Yeah, it's a free text right now. So let's see how many calories they consumed. So let's see. So one meal had after an egg breakfast was energy and macronutrients, so 42 grams, carbohydrates, and 96. Okay. So they basically kind of gave him, okay, I'm trying to kind of sense in here how many calories did the breakfast and the meals typically had. So let me see if I can see this. Yeah, so the breakfast meal were 2 eggs with 2 slices of bread and toast and 10 grams of margarine, which was about 23.5 grams of fat, 20 grams of carbohydrate, 25 grams of protein into the whole mix. When then they were given the same amount of cereal, eggs, and or not cereal, sugar, milk, and orange juice, it was 11 grams of protein, which mostly came from the milk, 5 grams of fat, and 73 grams of carbohydrate, and 11 grams of fiber. So it was actually a higher fiber meal, but it was so much more lower in the amount of protein that they had. And also, it was like the egg meal was definitely also kind of a little bit higher in fat. So I think it's a combination of protein and fats combined that increases the satiety, not necessarily like the fiber, which really is what helped obviously maintain the higher kind of intake. So what is the takeaway here for you listening to this podcast, and something that you can implement to yourself? Your breakfast should have a combination of protein, some carbs, but at the same time, don't skimp on fats, like healthier fats, adding maybe like avocados or even like the actual fats coming from the eggs. Sometimes like fats are definitely going to be calorie dense and can add a lot of calories into your day, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to completely cut them off. Specifically in this case, right? When you have a ton of carbs in one single meal and then very little protein, you're most likely going to feel a lot hungrier a lot quicker, because your body's probably processing through that a lot faster, even with the higher amount of fiber that we typically kind of talk about. So this was really interesting. Because again, it definitely can represent something important whenever you have, I mean, think about it. When you have a typical breakfast that is like a bagel and some orange juice and coffee, right? Like you're just on the go, something quick that you're getting maybe from Starbucks. Like you're most likely going to be starving by the time like lunch hits around. And then when you're making choices, maybe you went out to eat again or something like that, you're probably going to overconsume food compared to if you didn't. And let's be honest, let's say, for example, you consume 100 calories. Like this is why a lot of times when it comes down to weight loss, we don't always notice the smaller differences. Let's say that you were consuming like 100 calories less when you have a higher protein breakfast compared to a low protein breakfast. And you do that 5 times a week. If you are cutting down 100 calories every single lunch, compared to like when you were having the extra, we're talking about 500 calories less that you're consuming on a weekly basis just from that meal, and just by making that small adjustment into your breakfast. So the takeaway here is going to be to ensure that your breakfast choices prioritize protein and contain at least, I would say, 20 to 25 to 30 grams of protein at the minimum. So here's, for example, one way that I do. Let's say you wanted to have cereal and you wanted to because you love cereal. I love cereal. So what I typically do, and I think this is something that may actually help you do, I actually combine either like regular milk or almond milk, depending on what I'm feeling like. And I mix it up with like 1 scoop of whey protein powder. And I use that milk to mix with my cereal. And that's usually what I'm kind of having. And sometimes I add a little bit of peanut butter or almond butter right next to it. Sometimes even on the little side of the bowl. And that not only is delicious, but at the same time, it's also that it really, really fills me up a lot. So maybe it's not going to be the same thing as eggs, because like whey protein digests a lot quicker than eggs, for example, as far as a protein source. But that's a way that you can actually compromise and still have like a higher protein cereal choice without necessarily having way too many carbs in the process. So again, hopefully that's helpful. But I actually read this study that just came out recently, and I found it pretty interesting because it's pretty applicable to the things that you typically do on a daily basis. Second study that I thought was really interesting here is taurine supplementation. So taurine, you're going to find this a lot in like energy drinks. And I think they did this study out of Brazil. It had a lot of limitations, I feel like. They were really looking to see if like taurine supplementation increased fat burning during aerobic exercise, which means like cardio, right? And what they did is, because apparently there's some research and some data showing that taurine supplementation can increase what we call lipid metabolism or fat metabolism during high intensity exercise, potentially resulting in conservation of muscle glycogen stores, which is like sparing carbs and increasing the amount of fats that your body kind of like are using in the moment. So they really wanted to see what happens if we give some people either a placebo, 3 grams of taurine or 6 grams of taurine, and we put them to do fasting at 60% VO2 max, which is, it's an intensity where you can probably still have a conversation when you're doing it, but yet like it rises your heart rate up to a point where like it still obviously makes you kind of break a sweat after a certain while. So what they did again, like they look at 17 healthy young men, 24 years of age or so, and asked them to take it again, taurine 3 or 6 grams for a placebo 90 minutes before a 1 hour submaximal running session. So they were running a 60% VO2 max for about an hour. Following an overnight fast, the participant completed 3 exercise sessions separated about a week washout period. So very similar to the previous study, but then instead of giving them these breakfast options or whatever, they were giving them this like supplementation and put them through an exercise routine. And they basically, what they did is they looked at respiratory gas exchange. So it kind of like looks at how much your body's using fat versus carbohydrates. And then they kind of like look at some other like blood samples or so. I don't really remember exactly what that was. So what they found is like lipid oxidation, only fat burning, increased by 40% and carbohydrate oxidation decreased by 4% in the participants taking 6 grams of taurine compared to the placebo group. And the 3 grams of taurine increased lipid oxidation by 20% compared to the placebo, but did not affect carb oxidation. So interesting study, but at first sight, you'll be like, oh, I'm going to go and like supplement with 6 grams of taurine, and I'm going to go and do my fasted cardio. Hold your horses. This is where kind of reading the fine print and then reading the study at detail is important. This study did not control for diet whatsoever. They did not even ask any questions from what I understand about their diet. So we, for a matter of this, we have no idea what these like guys were actually doing, and whether or not like they kind of like made any kind of changes into their dietary approach. Now, of course, like a lot of statistical analysis when they did the studies, like look and control for some of those things, but I did not see that mentioned in there. So I wouldn't necessarily go and like buy 6 grams of taurine just by listening to this conversation or listening to this podcast and then the results of this, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on. And I promise I'm going to try to keep people posted on more studies on taurine to see if there's anything more in that may actually lead me to recommend it as a source, or as a proper supplementation for fat loss. Now, keep in mind, remember, I always say this, supplementing to try to accomplish a goal without a proper nutrition is like trying to, it's just kind of like trying to get like a, what's the word? Like I'm trying to think of an analogy. I'm like really kind of blanking on analogies right now. It's, I don't even know what the analogy is that I'm trying to think. But what I'm trying to say is that when you're trying to supplement to try to like fix your health and your nutrition without necessarily kind of like paying attention to what you're putting on your plate and how your nutrition is, it's kind of, it's completely, it's not pointless, but it doesn't always help because you're not paying attention to the bigger kind of factors in here that really is going to help. So that's, that's kind of like the main idea. I think the analogy I was thinking is like trying to, one mentor told me like, trying to do certain things is like building a business on a sinking ship. So it's like kind of like imagine like you're trying to kind of build your health and your fitness on a sinking ship, which means like it's not going to last too long when you're just simply trying to replace good nutrition with just simply a supplementation. So keep that in mind, but it's something to kind of keep an eye on. The last study that I wanted to share here on the other things too is like this is actually something that looked at what was it called? It's an intermittent fasting study that looked, actually, no, I'm going to leave that for later because I'm actually going to be recording a podcast with Alex Turoff actually tomorrow. So by the time of this recording, it's actually happening tomorrow. I'm not sure when this is going to release, but Alex invited me into her podcast to talk about fast mimicking diets. And definitely we're going to go deeper into those different kinds of things. But the one I wanted to talk a little bit more about is do resistance training combined with the ketogenic diet results in superior changes in body composition? And what they did is like they did a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is when they take a bunch of different studies, different randomized controlled trials, and they look to see what the changes and what the results were in the studies, and they combine them into this massive statistical mumbo jumbo analysis that they do to try to figure it out what happened across all these studies. So they involved about 244 participants. All these studies were comparing the effects of resistance training combined with ketogenic diets and non-ketogenic diets. All the participants included on these trials were 16 years old or older. And the durations of the studies, again, were from 3 weeks to 12 weeks or so. And carbohydrates were limited on ketogenic diets to 5 to 50 grams per day, which is actually kind of falls in line with ketogenic standards. And they look at body mass, they look at fat mass, fat-free mass, which is going to be like muscle mass, body mass index, which is your BMI, and body fat percentages. And what they found is like ketogenic diets seem to decrease body mass, fat-free mass, and BMI, and also body fat percentage compared to non-ketogenic diets. But the thing here is that, and one of the key areas in here is that the fact that it has been recognized that greater body mass loss is always accomplished with ketogenic diets, but a lot of times can be explained by the loss of stored glycogen, because a lot of like the ways that we're kind of measuring body composition do not take into account stored glycogen and the associated water weight that is typically lost whenever glycogen levels are lower when restricting carbohydrates. So that could be attributed to the idea of like carbohydrate or reduction of overall body mass in ketogenic diets compared to the other non-ketogenic diets. At the same time, the researchers also know that significant changes in body mass and fat mass were only seen in ad libitum studies, but not isocaloric studies. This is extremely important, which means that the studies that they looked at where they found differences in ketogenic diets versus non-ketogenic diets in body mass and fat mass, the participants were not giving specific meals. They were just simply kind of like told how to eat. And then they were just measuring to see how much you were eating. Going back to the study about like eggs, very similar to this, it was, like, okay, you were giving like free reign to eat whatever you wanted, but they were not really controlling how many calories they were consuming on each individual meal. Versus isocaloric studies, which is, again, and this is the type of studies where they give you a specific set amount of calories and every kind of like all your meals are controlled and all that, which is obviously the strength of those studies are typically going to be higher because you're controlling for many more variables in this process. So of course, when you look at those different kind of combination of things, like what they found is like people that were just kind of given free reign to eat whatever they want, and ketogenic diets say ate less. So why is that possible? Because we know that ketogenic diets typically tend to suppress appetite because of the higher fat intake. Go back to the previous, like the first study that I referenced, the amount of fat in that egg breakfast was a lot higher compared to the higher carbohydrate breakfast. So higher fats may have a higher satiety effect. So you tend to eat less. So the participants on the KD process, they may have decreased their calorie intake more than those eating the non-KD or the non-ketogenic diet, resulting in greater changes in body composition. So those are things that I think are important for us to consider. They also kind of finally mention in here, ketogenic diets were shown to reduce fat-free mass, which is, again, muscle mass, even when combined with resistance trainings, perhaps due to inhibition of the mTOR pathway, which is a key regulator in maintaining skeletal muscle mass associated with ketogenic diet. So again, even though these people in ketogenic diets lost muscle mass, they lost like weight and fat mass, they also lost, from what it shows on there, fat-free mass, which is, again, muscle mass, which it may not be ideal. Some of my friends like over at ASPE, like Dr. Alan Lowry and Dr. Jacob Wisdom, they did a study where they found that muscle mass can be accrued and can be increased on ketogenic diets when the right stimulus of training is present. But the reality is that not everybody can stimulate the training the way that they did it in those control conditions. So that's something also to consider in this process. Anyways, that's a good little research review here for you guys in this episode of a little bit of everything. So again, like just as a summary, we talked about eggs versus cereal breakfast, so higher protein / fat versus higher carb, very low protein intake, and see obviously what the difference it makes in like how much you consume in the subsequent meals. We talked about taurine supplementation, and we also talked a little bit about like the differences on a meta-analysis that they did of ketogenic diets versus non-ketogenic diets on resistance training and muscle mass and body composition. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. If you did, make sure that you leave either a review or just simply kind of take a screenshot right now of like this podcast that you're listening to and share it on your social media and tag me on it. Either myself, at Andres Ayesta on Instagram, or Planos Nutrition also. So we make sure that we kind of got your episode, or that we kind of got your or you enjoyed it and you just simply wanted to share it. So guys, thank you so much for listening into another episode of the Nutrition Blueprint podcast. We'll see you guys next week. Take care.